In September 1841, 15,000 people crowded into a muddy field in Syracuse, New York, for something America had never seen before, a state fair. They came for prize bulls and giant pumpkins, but what they remembered was the food. Number 19 on this list was sold 3 for a penny and shucked while you waited. Number 10 was an entire ox turned over a fire pit for 2 days straight. And number 3 contains an ingredient New Yorkers ate more of than beef. These 25 foods fed the very first American state fair, and most have vanished completely. Hit that subscribe button and let us count down what Americans actually ate in 1841. Number 25. Hasty pudding. Before anything fried or sugared showed up on that fairground, there was cornmeal and a pot. Hasty pudding was ground Indian corn stirred slowly into boiling salted water until it thickened into a stiff yellow porridge, then dosed with molasses or a lump of butter if a family had it. Cooks stirred it with a wooden spurtle for 20 minutes so it would not scorch or lump. And the smell of it bubbling was the smell of every farmhouse morning in the Northeast. At the fair, women sold it hot from iron kettles for a penny a bowl, ladled into wooden noggins that got wiped and reused. It sat heavy in the stomach and burned slow, which mattered when you were walking 100 acres of livestock pens all day. It was the plainest thing on the grounds. It was also the thing that had kept New Englanders alive for 200 years, and everybody knew it. Number 24. Johnny cake. If hasty pudding was the porridge, Johnny cake was the bread. Cornmeal, salt, and boiling water mixed into a thick batter, then spread on a greased griddle or the blade of a hoe held over coals, cooked until the outside went crisp and the inside stayed moist. Some called it journey cake because it kept for days in a saddlebag and did not spoil. Some called it hoe cake for how it was cooked. At Syracuse, vendors stacked them warm and sold them with a smear of fresh butter or a drizzle of maple syrup for a few pennies. The crust crackled between your teeth and the center tasted faintly sweet, like the corn it came from. A traveler who had ridden 2 days to see the exhibition could buy 3 and eat them walking. There was no yeast, no rising, no waiting. Just meal, fire, and hunger, which was most of American cooking in 1841. Number 23. Baked beans and salt pork. Saturday night beans were a northern institution, and no fair would run without a few great crocks of them steaming under canvas. Dried navy or yellow eye beans were soaked overnight, then baked low and slow for the better part of a day, with a fist-sized chunk of salt pork buried in the middle and a good pour of molasses over the top. The pork rendered down and turned the beans silky and brown, and the molasses gave them that dark, almost burnt sweetness that Boston made famous. A bowl cost a few cents and filled a working man completely. Farmers who had come in from the counties around Onondaga recognized it instantly because it was the same pot their own wives had waiting at home. It traveled well, it reheated forever, and it never went bad in a day of sitting out. This was fuel, plain and honest, and it disappeared down every throat on the grounds. Number 22. Switchel. Long before anyone bottled a sports drink, there was switchel. And on a warm September afternoon, it was worth more than gold. Also called haymaker's punch. It was cold water mixed with cider vinegar, molasses or maple syrup, and a knob of grated ginger. Field hands drank it during harvest because the vinegar cut thirst better than plain water, and the molasses put sugar back in a tired body. At the fair, boys carried buckets of it through the crowd with a tin dipper on a string, selling a swallow for a penny. It was sharp and sweet and warming from the ginger all at once, and it hit the back of your throat like something medicinal. People who had been standing in the sun watching plowing matches lined up for it. Nobody makes it now. And that is a genuine loss, because on a hot day, Switchell does exactly what it promises and asks for nothing but a jug. Number 21. Roasted chestnuts. Autumn. In New York meant chestnuts, and in 1841 the American chestnut still towered over every ridge in the state, dropping bushels of nuts that anyone could gather for free. Vendors at the fair set up little braziers of glowing coals and roasted them in perforated iron pans, shaking them until the shells split and blackened. You bought a paper twist of them hot enough to burn your fingers, peeled back the charred shell, and ate the sweet, starchy meat inside while they steamed in the cool air. A handful cost a penny or two. The smell drifted across the whole fairground, smoky and sweet, pulling children by the nose. What almost nobody watching that fire could have imagined is that within 70 years, a blight would wipe the American chestnut almost entirely off the continent. The nut that fed that crowd for pennies is nearly a ghost today. In 1841, it was everywhere, and it was free. Number 20. Spruce beer. Not everything poured at the fair had alcohol in it, and spruce beer was the family drink. Brewed from molasses, water, and the young tips of spruce or hemlock boughs, then fermented just enough to fizz, it came out a pale amber with a piney, resinous bite that tasted like the forest smelled. Sailors had drunk it for a century because the spruce warded off scurvy, and by the 1840s, every tavern and fair booth kept a barrel. It was cheap to make, kept in a keg for weeks, and could be brewed strong or barely fizzy for children. A mug cost a penny or two, and it went down cold and strange and refreshing after a plate of salt pork. People today would find the flavor bizarre, almost like drinking a Christmas tree, but to a New Yorker in 1841, it was as ordinary as soda pop. It was the taste of the woods bottled up. Number 19. Pickled oysters. Here is the one that surprises people. In 1841, oysters were not a luxury. They were the cheapest protein in the state, dredged by the millions out of New York Harbor and shipped inland, packed in barrels of their own liquor and ice. At the fair, oystermen sold them shucked fresh, 3 for a penny, or pickled, which was how they traveled to a landlocked place like Syracuse. The oysters were poached briefly, then packed in a spiced brine of vinegar, mace, whole peppercorns, and cloves, where they kept for weeks and turned firm and tangy. You fished them out of the crock with a fork and ate them standing up, cold and briny and sharp. City folk and farmers ate them by the dozen without a second thought. The idea that an oyster was fancy would have made a New Yorker in 1841 laugh out loud. They were bar food, street food, and fair food, and they were everywhere. Here is where it gets interesting. That fair in Syracuse was not just a market with food stalls. It was the very first New York State Fair, organized by the New York State Agricultural Society, and it changed the country. The whole idea of a competitive agricultural exhibition had been imported from Europe and championed by a man named Elkanah Watson, who believed that if you offered cash premiums for the best bull, the best cheese, the best plowing, farmers would compete their way into better methods. He was right. Over 2 days at the end of September 1841, thousands of farmers walked those pens, studying breeding stock, arguing over new plows, and comparing seed. The food vendors were an afterthought, there to feed the crowds. But that crowd, eating johnny cake and pickled oysters between the cattle sheds, was witnessing the birth of an institution that every state in the Union would eventually copy. The fair was really a classroom. It just smelled like roasting chestnuts. Number 18. Buckwheat cakes. When the September mornings turned cold, nothing warmed a fairgoer like a stack of buckwheat cakes off a hot griddle. Buckwheat flour was fermented overnight with a bit of yeast or leftover batter, which gave the cakes a dark color and a distinctive sour tang. that ordinary flour could never match. Cooks poured them thin, flipped them fast, and stacked them steaming, then drowned them in maple syrup or molasses. A plate cost a few cents. The batter kept working in the crock for days, growing more sour and complex, so a good vendor's cakes tasted better on the second morning than the first. They were earthy, tangy, and filling, and upstate New York grew buckwheat by the ton because it thrived in poor soil where wheat would fail. Today, most Americans have never tasted a real fermented buckwheat cake. In 1841, it was the breakfast that got a farmer through a freezing morning of judging livestock. Number 17, country ham. A whole cured ham was a centerpiece, and the fair drew out the best of them. Farm families spent all winter salting, smoking, and aging their hogs, and a good ham represented months of careful work hanging in a smokehouse. At Syracuse, vendors carved thin slices off dark, dense hams that had been cured hard enough to keep a year without spoiling. The meat was intensely salty, deep red, and so concentrated in flavor that a little went a long way, usually laid on a slab of bread. A slice cost more than most fair food, maybe a York shilling, because a cured ham was genuinely valuable. Some of those hams were entered in the competition itself, judged alongside the cheese and the preserves for a premium. The smoke and salt of country ham was the taste of a well-run farm, and every family that walked past a booth carving one knew exactly how much labor was hanging on that hook. Number 16, donuts. New York was Dutch country long before it was English, and the Dutch left behind the oliekoek, the oil cake, which by 1841 Americans simply called the donut. These were rounds of sweet yeasted or sour milk dough, dropped into a kettle of bubbling lard until they puffed and browned, then dredged in sugar while still hot. The best ones had a nut or a bit of dried apple pressed into the center, which is one story of how the whole came to be. At the fair, the smell of frying dough pulled the crowd like a magnet, and a vendor could sell them as fast as the kettle produced them, a penny or two apiece. They came out crisp on the outside and tender and steaming within, heavy with the rich taste of the lard. Fried sweet dough at a fair is one of the few things on this entire list that never disappeared. It just got bigger. Number 15, souse. Nothing on a 19th century farm was wasted, least of all a slaughtered hog, and souse was the proof. Also called head cheese, though it contained no cheese at all, it was made by simmering the head, feet, and trimmings of a pig for hours until the meat fell off and the liquid turned thick with natural gelatin. The meat was picked, seasoned heavily with vinegar, sage, and pepper, packed into a mold, and chilled until it set into a firm, sliceable loaf shot through with bits of pork suspended in savory jelly. At the fair, it was sliced cold and sold cheap, eaten on bread with mustard. The vinegar gave it a bright, sharp tang that cut the richness. Modern shoppers recoil at the name, but a farmer in 1841 saw souse as simple good sense. It turned the parts of the animal nobody wanted into a food that kept for a week and tasted better than it had any right to. Number 14, succotash. This is a dish older than the country eating it. The word comes from a Narragansett term, and Native Americans were growing corn and beans together and cooking them together long before any Europeans set foot in New York. By 1841, succotash was pure American comfort food, fresh or dried corn kernels and shell beans, usually called cranberry or lima, simmered together with a piece of salt pork and a little cream if you had it. At the fair, in late September, the corn would have been at its sweetest, so vendors could cook it fresh off the cob, the kernels bursting between the tender beans. A bowl cost a few cents. It was mild, sweet, and satisfying. the corn and beans forming a complete protein that early cooks understood by instinct, if not by chemistry. It sat on tables all over the grounds, humble and unremarkable, carrying a history older than the fair, older than the state, older than the flag flying over it. Here is something worth stopping on. Every food on this list came out of the same iron rule that governed the American farm kitchen in 1841. Waste nothing. The souse used the pig's head. The switchel used vinegar that was itself a way to save cider that had turned. The buckwheat batter was kept alive for days. This was not a philosophy anybody wrote down. It was survival math, practiced by families who lived a bad harvest away from real hunger. And it is exactly what the agricultural society was trying to reward. Those premiums for the best cheese and the fattest hog were not vanity prizes. They were an attempt to teach a whole state how to squeeze more food out of the same land. The crowd eating these dishes between the cattle pens was practicing thrift so total that it now looks like a lost art. They fed a family of 8 on what we throw in the bin, and they did it well. Number 13, Indian pudding. When the fair crowd wanted something sweet and warm as the evening cooled, Indian pudding was waiting in the kettle. It was cornmeal, or Indian meal as they called it, slowly cooked into milk with molasses, butter, and a heavy hand of ginger and cinnamon, then baked for hours until it set into a dark, dense, spiced custard. The long baking gave it a deep caramel color and a soft, almost grainy texture that was nothing like a smooth pudding. Served hot with a spoonful of cream melting on top, it tasted of molasses and warm spice, and it filled you like a meal. A dish cost a few pennies. It was the kind of thing that took all day to make, so buying it ready-made at a fair was a small luxury for a farm family. The molasses did the sweetening, because refined sugar was still expensive, which is why so much of what that crowd ate carried that same dark, treacly depth. Number 12, pumpkin pie. Late September in New York meant the pumpkin harvest was in, and the fairgrounds would have been thick with the smell of pie. But the 1841 version was not quite the one on your Thanksgiving table. Pumpkin was stewed down and strained, then mixed with milk or cream, eggs, molasses, and heavy spicing of ginger and nutmeg, and baked in a sturdy crust made with lard. Sugar was scarce and dear, so molasses did much of the sweetening, giving the filling a darker, richer, less candy-like flavor than a modern pie. A wedge cost a few cents. The custard was firm enough to hold in your hand, which mattered when you were eating it while walking the exhibition. Pumpkin grew like a weed across every farm in the state, which made the pie cheap and everywhere. It was already, by 1841, tangled up with the American idea of harvest and home, and it tasted like autumn itself. Number 11, New York cheese. This was cheese country, and the fair was where a dairy farmer's reputation was made or broken. The New York State Agricultural Society offered premiums for the finest cheeses, and farm wives brought their best wheels wrapped in cloth to be judged, some of them weighing 40 or 50 pounds. Herkimer and Oneida counties were already famous for a firm, sharp, golden cheddar that aged for months and shipped down the Erie Canal to feed the whole eastern seaboard. At the fair, cheese was both competition and snack, sold in wedges cut off a great wheel and eaten with bread and cider. The good stuff was dense, crumbly, and pungent, with a bite that built as it aged. A wedge cost a York shilling or so. Cheese making was one of the few forms of farm income controlled almost entirely by women, and a blue ribbon on a wheel of cheese at Syracuse was a genuine mark of skill that the whole county would talk about. Number 10, roast ox. Now for the spectacle. When a crowd this size gathered, somebody with ambition would put an entire ox on the fire, and it became an event in itself. The whole animal, dressed and skewered on an iron spit the size of a fence rail, was turned slowly over a long pit of coals for the better part of 2 days, basted with salted water and its own dripping fat as it browned. Men took shifts cranking the spit through the night while the smell of roasting beef rolled across the entire fairground. When it was finally carved, the meat was sold cheap by the slice, or sometimes given away to draw a crowd for a politician or a merchant. The outside was crisp and smoky, the inside dripping and tender. A whole ox roast was less about the food than the theater of it, a public feast that told everyone present that this gathering was something grand. Nobody who smelled it forgot it. Here is the part the picture postcards leave out. That crowd was drinking, and in 1841, America was in the middle of a furious argument about it. The temperance movement was sweeping the Northeast, with preachers and reformers demanding that Americans put down the cider jug and the whiskey bottle for good. And Americans in 1841 drank an astonishing amount, far more per person than we do today, much of it hard cider that ran like water at any public gathering. So a fair was a battleground. You had cider barrels and whiskey being sold at one end, and temperance men handing out pledges and pouring switchel and lemonade at the other, each side certain it was saving the republic. The food and drink on those grounds were not neutral. What you chose to put in your cup was, to a lot of people watching, a statement about what kind of country this was going to be. The fair fed that fight as surely as it fed the crowd. Number 9. Fair sausages. Sausage was another way the farm wasted nothing, and it turned up hot off the griddle all over the grounds. Ground pork trimmings were seasoned hard with sage, salt, and pepper, stuffed into cleaned casings, and either sold fresh to fry or already smoked for keeping. At the fair, vendors cooked links over coals until the skin blistered and split, and sold them sizzling on a slab of bread for a few cents. The sage and pepper cut through the fat, and the smell of them cooking competed with the donuts for the attention of the crowd. Every farm made its own, seasoned to a family recipe, so a good sausage vendor was selling not just meat, but a particular taste of home. This was handheld, walk-and-eat food a full century and a half before anybody called it that. A farmer could buy a hot sausage, keep watching the plowing match, and never break his stride. Number 8. Molasses taffy. For the children dragging their parents through the fairground, the real destination was the candy, and molasses taffy was king. Molasses was boiled with a little butter and vinegar to the hard crack stage, then poured out to cool just enough to handle, at which point somebody with strong hands pulled it. The pulling was half the show. The dark, sticky rope was stretched and folded over and over, working air into it until it lightened to a glossy golden brown and turned chewy instead of brittle. Then it was cut into little twists with scissors and sold by the piece for a penny. It was sweet, faintly bitter from the molasses, and it stuck to your teeth for the rest of the afternoon. Taffy pulls were a social event in their own right back home, so buying it ready pulled at the fair was a small indulgence. For a child in 1841, a penny twist of molasses taffy was as good as the day got. Number 7. Maple sugar. Before cane sugar was cheap, the North sweetened itself with maple, and by fair season the previous spring's sugaring was pressed into hard cakes for sale. In March and April, farm families had tapped their maples, boiled the sap down over open fires for days, and poured the thick syrup into molds, where it set into dense blocks of maple sugar that kept for months. At the fair, these cakes were sold whole or shaved into flakes, and children gnawed on chunks like candy. The flavor was pure concentrated maple, richer and more complex than any syrup, with a grainy melt that coated the tongue. A cake cost more than molasses candy because sugaring was brutal labor, but it was a taste of the farm's own woods. Maple sugar was also a point of pride for the temperance crowd, a homegrown northern sweetener that owed nothing to the slave-worked cane plantations of the South, which made eating it, for some, a quiet act of conscience. Number 6. Crullers. Cousin to the donut but fancier, the cruller was fried dough with ambition. The Dutch-descended cooks of New York twisted or braided a rich egg dough, sometimes flavored with nutmeg or a splash of rose water, and fried it in lard until it turned crisp and golden and hollow inside. Where a donut was round and plain, a cruller was long, twisted, and delicate, dusted in sugar and snapping when you bit it. At the fair, they were stacked in glass cases or piled on cloth-covered boards, selling briskly at a penny or two. The egg in the dough made them lighter and richer than an ordinary fried cake, closer to a pastry than a bread. They were the sort of thing a farm wife made for company or a holiday, so finding them for sale at the fair felt like a treat above the ordinary. Crisp, sweet, and faintly perfumed with nutmeg, a good cruller was fried dough dressed in its Sunday best. Number 5. Apple pie. New York was becoming an apple empire, its orchards thickening across every county, and by late September the fair would have been buried in pie. The apples were peeled, sliced, and packed into a lard crust with a little sugar or molasses, cinnamon, and sometimes a splash of cider, then baked until the crust browned and the fruit collapsed into something soft and spiced. A wedge cost a few cents. What made a fair pie special was the sheer variety of apples available in 1841. Hundreds of named heirloom types most of us will never taste, each with its own tartness and texture, so no two vendors' pies were quite alike. The crust was sturdy enough to eat out of hand, because half the point of fair food was that you could walk and eat at once. Apple pie was already shorthand for American, and standing in a New York apple town, eating a wedge of it in 1841, you understood exactly why. Number 4. Cider. Here is where the argument I mentioned came right to the surface, because cider was the drink of the American farm, and the fair floated on it. Sweet cider, fresh pressed from the autumn apples, was cloudy, golden, and only faintly fizzy, sold by the mug for a penny to anyone dry from the dust. But most of the cider at a gathering like this was hard, fermented into something with real bite, and Americans in 1841 drank it in quantities that would stagger a modern doctor. Every farm had a cider mill and a cellar full of barrels, and it was cheaper and safer than the water. That is precisely why the temperance reformers were furious about it, and why a fair could feel like two camps eyeing each other across the grounds. Cider was the everyday drink of the whole rural North, sweet for the children and hard for the men, and no event in 1841 ran without barrels of it rolling in. Number 3. Oyster stew. I told you an ingredient on this list was eaten more than beef, and this is where it pays off, because oysters were so cheap and so abundant that a hot oyster stew was ordinary fair food, not a delicacy. Oysters shipped inland in barrels were simmered gently in milk or cream with butter, a little salt, and a scrape of pepper, cooked just until their edges curled, then ladled steaming into bowls with a few crackers crumbled on top. It cost a few cents. The broth turned silky and faintly sweet from the oyster liquor, and the plump oysters gave way soft between your teeth. On a cold September evening at the fairground, a bowl of oyster stew was warmth in your hands and a full belly for pennies. It astonishes people now that a landlocked fair in 1841 would be selling oyster stew as everyday food. But that was the reality of a country where the oyster was the poor man's protein. Number 2. Lemonade. Every fair in America eventually pairs with one drink above all others. And even in 1841, the temperance men had already made lemonade their banner. Lemons shipped up from the South and the Caribbean, squeezed into cold water with sugar and sold by the glass, gave the reformers something sweet and respectable to put in a fairgoer's hand instead of hard cider. Boys hawked it through the crowd, and it cost a penny or two a glass, tart and cold and bright in a way that cut through the dust and the roasting meat smoke. It was a small luxury because sugar and lemons both cost money, which made a glass of real lemonade feel like a treat. And it carried a message. Choosing lemonade over cider was, in that charged year, a quiet way of taking a side. The pairing of a fare with a cold, sweet drink started here, in exactly this argument, and it never went away. Number 1. Gingerbread. Nothing says 19th century fare like gingerbread because the two grew up together. This was not a soft modern cake, but a dense, dark, chewy slab made with molasses, ginger, and a heavy hand of spice, baked hard enough to hold its shape in a pocket and travel a day without crumbling. Vendors cut it into thick squares or pressed it into carved wooden molds shaped like animals, hearts, and soldiers, and sold it for a penny to every child on the grounds. It was intensely spiced, sweet from the molasses, and it filled the fairground air with the smell of ginger and warm sugar. Gingerbread and lemonade was the phrase that meant a fair for the better part of a century, the two together forming the original American fair meal. If you had walked out of that Syracuse fairground in September 1841 with one taste in your mouth, it would have been this: dark, chewy, spiced gingerbread, the food that a whole nation of fairs would be built on. That is what Americans actually ate at the first state fair. And here is my challenge. Make one of these this week: the switchel, the Indian pudding, the molasses taffy, the buckwheat cakes. Then come back and tell me if the people of 1841 knew something we forgot. Drop the one you are going to try in the comments and tell me this: did you have any idea oysters were once cheaper than beef? Because these were not quaint little novelties. They were the food that fed the very first American fair, and most of them are gone. Now you know they were ever here.